Yeah. If it's like a church service, they'll just spread them all out. Have people in the back. All right. Here you go, Brooke. Here you go, Brett.
I just went to get my husband.
Sounds good. There you go. Getting refreshment.
So if we're thinking of having a baby, should we come in?
Yeah. Miracle baby. Go. Oh, yeah. All right. Well, before we start streaming, just a little bit of word about format. I was asked by parents that weren't able to be here every week that if we could record them, that would be awesome. Sometimes our spouse is sick and we don't have the chance to talk about it, or maybe they're working. And maybe for reference of other people, if you find the lessons helpful to you and you think they might be helpful to others, you can pass it along. And the YouTube channel that will have this kind of lecture series will be on YouTube, so that you could take notes, watch it again, or refer it or copy it to somebody else that you think it might be helpful. And one of the scriptural foundations that I really love about parenting is Psalm 127. And so we'll open with that. Ready to go? Okay. We'll start with just a reading of Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. Behold, children are a blessing from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. Please join me in a word of prayer. Thank you, God, for this day that you've given us to look to your word for wondrous truths. May they be transformative for us. In Jesus' name, amen. So if anybody did not get an outline, I've got outlines of today's lecture right over there. If not, you could just listen to it and pick it up later. It is structured, actually, so that you can do devotions. I'm not going to read the complete text that I've got behind each skill set. But if you do want to look up those scriptures, it's perfect for devotional reading as a couple or as a single parent. The first one is establish structure and rules. Basically, children test limits all the time, and if they don't have limits, they just keep on rolling. And basically, by establishing rules in your house, children learn what's right, what's wrong, what to expect. And all of life has rules and boundaries, a rule set that you have to live by, so you're essentially setting them up for success if you establish rules for your own house. If we look at the scriptures, not only Psalm 78, which teaches the history of Israel and how we teach our children the lessons of history so that they're not lost in future generations, the whole Garden of Eden story, God gave them a boundary, and God said to them, this is the boundary, this is the fruit you can eat, this is the fruit you ought not eat. If you eat this fruit, that you're not supposed to eat. This is what's going to happen. And so it's a great illustration of how we as parents set boundaries for our children so they know how to live. In addition to that, another example of boundary setting is God says, this is what moral reality and truth is. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. And so, we can easily reduce those to say, thou shalt not be mean to your sister. Thou shalt not lie to your parents. Honor your father and mother. So a lot of the actual rules that we set for our house have already been established for us in Scripture as Christians. And so we don't have to go from scratch to set up our own rule system if we follow the Lord's instruction. But the structure provides consistency for our children so that they know what to expect and what the boundaries are. Now, when it comes to setting boundaries in your house and setting your rules, there's 3 basic principles that are very helpful for us. And you could say these are the ingredients to building structure in your home. One is consistency, that you do the same thing every time, no matter how tired you are. So consistency is you set the rule, you know what the rule is, and your kids will soon know what the rule is because it's enforced every single time. Anytime a boundary is breached, there's correction offered. So the rules aren't changing by the day. Second is predictability. Predictability is you know what is going to happen if you do this. If you are obedient, there's likely a consistent reward and affirmation that comes after it. And you could set a clock to it. So if you, as your parenting methodology is established, you want your kids to be able to depend on you like you depend on your time. You look at your watch, it's dependable, it's right on all the time. And what this does, it provides a structure of your household where your kids gain a lot of confidence. And they know where they are, they know where they're going, they know if they do this, they'll be rewarded. If they do this, there's going to be some kind of a negative discipline. And follow through. Follow through is enforcing the consequence, whether it be positively or negatively. And we have to have follow through to our rules, otherwise kids don't affirm it as being the right way. So essentially this is teaching our kids right from wrong, the ABCs of it. And if you've not set rules, this is especially a challenge if you come from different households. If you have a household that has a very permissive parent, you have another household that was very strict parent, you really have to come together so that you're on the same page when it comes to the rules. Because if you're trying to enforce a rule that your spouse or somebody else in the house isn't reinforcing, then it gets very confusing. I also encourage this, if you have people that watch your kids, grandma and grandpa, if you let them know what your rules are, then they can reinforce those same rules in their house. So consistency, predictability, and follow through. So the first basic skill of parenting is establish the structure and the rules, set the rules. And you can even set rules for your house that go beyond just discipline. For example, you could set the rule for your house that you will love your neighbors. That could be the rule of your house. That as your children are growing up, you're frequently loving your neighbors with acts of kindness and goodness, for example. So it's not all about just do's and don'ts. It's obedience to God to set a vision for a Christian worldview all around. The second biblical skill is training your children, not micromanaging them. Some of you know Proverbs 22, verse 6. Train up your child in the way they should go, and when they grow old, they will not depart from it. And oftentimes as parents, we just think about teaching our children, and there's a difference between teaching our children and training them. When I think of training, you might think of a sport where there's spring training or training before the season begins. And essentially what you do is you take your team through drills. You just drill it into them. You need to understand the basics of the sport that you're going to do, and you want it to become reflex after a while. So it's a trained behavior. Now, when it comes to training for a sport, one of the first things you do is you have to learn the rules, right? So when you have established rules for your house, when it comes to training them, you're training them to go by the rules, similar to a sport. So over and over and over, they're corrected and reinforced this proper behavior. And this is everyday training drills. You don't line up your kids and say, okay, be obedient. Things like this. It's the everyday consistency. And when it comes to training your children, I want to talk about personalities here for a little bit. Anyone here grow up in a very permissive house where you could pretty much do anything? Anyone? Couple? Few? Yeah, sarcastic. I know that that's not true. Permissive is one style, authoritarian is another, and authoritative is the third. We're going to go for the third, but first I want to explain the other personalities. Permissive parents are overly lenient. Oftentimes we can identify parents that are overly lenient because we would call that child spoiled or very selfish. These are children that usually don't play well with others because they're always getting what they want, and so you get into a group and they don't get what they want and they throw a fit right away. The difference between a permissive parent and a parent that's authoritative is when you're in the grocery store, a permissive parent will give the child anything they want to get them quiet. The authoritative parent is the one that might take them out of the grocery store, discipline them, and bring them back in. And the authoritarian parent would let them have it right there. Essentially, parents that are permissive have a tendency towards only a couple rules. A couple simple rules, and that's it. And so there's not clear boundaries everywhere. There's not enough rules to reinforce good and bad and expected behavior. So as a result of not clearly laying those out, children are trying to discover what those boundaries are constantly. They also will test a parent, because children test boundaries no matter what. All children do. So, for example, a child, when they're little, they'll cry to get food. If they're not disciplined, as they get a little bit older, to know that they don't get food just by crying, then that's the child in the grocery store that will throw a fit until they get the animal crackers. Okay? So some parents will appease their children because they don't want them crying in the grocery store, so every time they go in the store, they've got to get animal crackers. Otherwise, their children will throw a fit. When it comes to predictability and follow-through, like I talked about with setting of rules, it always has to be followed through. If a child acts that way 5, 6, 7 times in a row, lengthening the fit, and then they get the food because you just are worn out and you give in, the only thing that they learned is they have to keep it up until they get rewarded. So this is how these two areas overlap, of training children and following the rules. So I think all of us kind of know what permissive parenting looks like. It actually looks like chaos. The authoritarian, that's usually over strict. This parent has a tendency to set rules for everything. There's a rule of life in everything, and as a result, children are crossing that rule over and over and over again, and as a result, they're being disciplined in a negative fashion almost all the time. To get out from under the oppression of the authoritarian style, children have a tendency to become secretive. They don't tell the truth. They hide things, and they lie because they know if they're honest about anything, they'll get disciplined. As they get a little bit older, that represents itself in rebelliousness and resentment. Now, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4 says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children." Now, exasperate means that you're provoking them to anger. You're making your kids angry at you. They resent you because you've got so many rules that every single day they're breaking rules, and you can never be pleased because every rule must be followed to the letter of the law. Now, the middle ground in this is the authoritative parent. Have you ever witnessed a family system where the children are out of control and you think in your mind, and you might be willing to say it out loud, who is the parent here? Because it seems like the children are running the show and the parents are just hanging on for dear life. The authoritative parent is one that's in charge. You're the one that carries the authority. You're the one that sets the rules. You're the one that reinforces the rules in a consistent, predictable way. But there's enough flexibility to understand personalities of children. There's a responsiveness to your individual children that allow you to tailor your parenting style with them as they grow into themselves. Remember, train up a child in the way they should go, not in the way that you want them to go. And this is a borne-out fact. You can go outside of Christian parenting to discover this. Parents that are too strict have kids that will rebel in incredible ways. Parents that are too permissive, your kids go wild. And the authoritative parents are sort of the middle ground, and they're really best adjusted to society. The third parenting skill is cultivating a safe home environment. And security is huge for kids. They want to have a safe place. They want to be protected. And to use another sports analogy, if you have a good school system and a strong athletic program, when you play a home game, we use an expression, you have the home field advantage. Now, the home field advantage is essentially you're familiar with your surroundings. You know, if it's football, you know what the ground is like. If it's basketball, you know what the feel is going to be like. If you're strongly supported as a home team with a lot of fans, you've got people cheering for you. And so it's a system that will help you succeed more often than not. Now, there are some households that don't have a home field advantage. Those households are indicative when there is some form of abuse, chaos, disruption, abandonment, trauma, where those children are actually more successful being in a different house than yours. So when it comes to cultivating a home that has a safe environment, it's not just safe from physical injury, where there's not dangers everywhere, but it's a nurturing place where they're affirmed, listened to, recognized as a little human being that is loved, and they know the behaviors that are expected, and the knowns displace the unknowns. If you drop somebody into a situation where you don't know what the boundaries are, you don't know what the dangers are, you don't know what the pros and cons are, there's a lot of fear there. This is why when it comes to early development in children, when there are stresses at home and mom and dad argue, one of the greatest fears that children have is that mom and dad are going to separate. Because, they know other children that have parents that are separated in the chaos and the turmoil that comes with that. And so they hear a kind of arguing and anger in the house, and it strikes fear in the hearts of the children. So we want to cultivate a safe environment as much as possible so that our children have a home field advantage. The fourth parenting skill is training resiliency. My parents called it grit. You let your kids make mistakes. You reinforce that a failure is only a failure if you fail to learn from it. Effort is more important than outcome. If you have a really intelligent child, they might get straight A's without even working for it. And you have to cultivate in them a work ethic in other areas, otherwise they don't learn to work. If you have a child that doesn't have that same intellectual base, then they have to work really hard and they might get C's. So wherever your child is, this is why teaching effort is more important than outcome. We just don't reward for the final product. We have to be sensitive to the process itself, focusing on the contribution instead of the achievement. Now, life is full of challenges. And if they don't learn to overcome challenges, it's a big problem. I'll get into this a little bit more I think it's next week, Generation Z kids. Generation Z kids grow up with a lot of digital achievements, but not a lot of experience in life. And they don't know how to do things, they don't know how to face obstacles and overcome them. But we know life is full of obstacles, and if they're not in that training ground now, how do we expect them to succeed in the future? For example, if we're training our children how to be fiscally responsible, for example, as a child, handling their own money, they likely will not know how to handle money when they get older. Personal example, I didn't take any basic math classes when I was in high school. Geometry, I took some of the hard courses. I didn't take the Gen Ed math. In Gen Ed math, they taught you how to balance a checkbook. I never learned how to balance a checkbook. I didn't know how to write a check. So I'm going off to college. Now, I know checks are kind of obsolete these days. So for your younger generation, there's actually a piece of paper, you write it, and okay, so you write a check to someone, and then you have to write out the dollar amount with words. I never wrote a check in my life. The first check I ever wrote in my life was for $3,400 and some dollars. It was my first tuition check I ever wrote. And I'm standing there. I've got to pay it. I worked all summer. All my money went into there, but I didn't spend any of my money. My parents bought me all my stuff so that I would pay for school. And so I'm looking at other people write checks so that I could figure out how to do it. Now, we teach our children how to face all kinds of challenges. Just for kind of a future announcement, Dylan and Kayla are going to be teaching a course on resolving conflict in the church here soon. We teach our children resiliency by resolving conflict properly. You're resilient in your relationships as well as other things. And so we train them so they face the challenges and are up for that challenge so that when they have to resolve conflict or overcome an obstacle, they've got confidence in doing it. Manage your stress so it doesn't affect your kids. We have what I would call leadership leak. Every parent leaks their own leadership style, strengths, and weaknesses. You will overflow on your kids. If you are overstressed, that stress will overflow on your kids. If a person is highly stressed, their temperament is different, shorter. The patience level is less. All the different things that overflow from you will hit your kids. I want to put it another way. All of us have baggage. Some of us have baggage from experiences in life. Some of us have baggage from the households that we grew up with our parents or lack of parents. So let's suppose you grow up in a household where there's neglect. Your baggage is a bag of neglect. If you haven't worked through that in your heart, the overflow of that difficulty will flow out on your kids. Let's suppose you grew up in a household where there was verbal abuse or physical abuse. We want to make sure that we deal with our stuff so that our kids don't carry it. If, for example, your child was able to identify in you a certain mood, and the first thing they do is off to their room, it's like, time to get out of here quick before this blows up. They can predict what's going to happen because they've seen this happen so many times before. That's the picture of a household that's not settled and not safe all the time, and so they seek refuge in their room or out in the backyard or over at a friend's house. There's oftentimes in a household like this, children will always play somewhere else because they don't want to invite their friends home to their house. And they would like to be in a place that is more conducive and either safe or fun to grow up in. So Manage your own stress so it doesn't overflow on your kids. And if you have a particular trouble area, learn about it. Read a book, ask for a recommendation, get Christian counseling, especially if you've experienced something very traumatic. Next skill set, learn to intentionally encourage your child's healthy behavior as to not overemphasize the bad. In other words, try to use affirmation and encouragement more than negative disciplines. If you are constantly correcting your children while not affirming their misbehavior, they begin to believe that they are bad. If a child begins to believe that they are bad, that is the way that they will act to fulfill their belief as they grow older. So we don't want them internalizing that they're bad kids. We want them internalized that they're appreciated, valued, and they have some really good qualities that have been affirmed over and over by mom and dad. The next skill set is exercising self-control. With this one, self-control is always beneficial in lifestyle, in spending, in relationships, but it's particularly known by children when it comes to disciplining them. And one of the issues that I like to draw out is one way to say exercise self-control is don't yell at your kids. Now, I don't know of any parent that's never yelled at their kids, so I don't know if that's entirely possible by any parent, especially if your child is going towards the road or something like that. Parents do yell, but it's not the best way to communicate in the everyday. If your pattern of parenting is yelling a lot, I would just encourage you to ask yourself why you're yelling. And yelling is often a reflex of anger and frustration, so it's a very reactive thing. Something happens and our reaction is to yell. And if we're considering our words before we speak, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. The scriptures tell us to be angry, but do not sin in your anger. There's a lot of things that children do that anger us as parents, and that's just a fact. But if you look at all the scriptures of anger with human beings in the Bible, there's only 4 or 5 positive expressions of human anger in all of Scripture. All the rest have negative effects. So learn to have self-control. I use the yelling thing, but self-control in eating, self-control in finances, self-control with alcohol, self-control with exercise. Self-control is one of those topical areas as a parent. And you train your children not to be out of control. I'll give you an example of this. When my children were little, if they experienced a thrill of emotion, they would scream sometimes, especially the girls. In excitement, they'd scream. But to the sound of the ear as a parent, there's no difference between that scream and a scream of somebody grabbing them by the arm and trying to abduct them, right? So we trained the kids not to scream so you don't scream just when you're happy or excited. You only scream if you're physically injured or, something really bad's happening, like some stranger grabs you or something like that. And so you're training them self-control so that everybody lives a more balanced life. Another thing about self-control, self-controlled parents earn respect. And respect is both earned and given. If we as a parent are out of control, our children see that disorder and their level of respect for us diminishes. The next skill set, teach your children to work and be responsible. There are so many important lessons through learning hard work. Again, I'll probably unpack this a little bit more with Generation Z. where a lot of their achievements in life are digital. But learning how to work and having a biblical work ethic is giving our children an incredible advantage. You learn cooperation. You learn respect for authority. You learn the value of money. You learn the importance of a good attitude. You learn the importance of timeliness. I mean, the broad range of skills that you gain with a biblical work ethic will set your children up for success. The opening psalm that I read, Psalm 127, said that children are a blessing from God. Blessed is the man who has a quiver full of them. Now, how many of you would look forward to shooting a crooked arrow? Crooked arrows perform terribly. If you've got an arrow that's bent and you shoot it, it just goes wherever it might go. Like if you take the fletching off, the arrow could go anywhere. So when we're raising our children, our job is to make them as straight as possible so that when we release them, they go where they're getting aimed. And so when it comes to teaching our children for success, they need to know how to work. And here's the basic principle. All of you that are parents know this. Parenting is work, isn't it? It's hard work. Like going to the beach or going on vacation before children, easy peasy. You get 2 or 3 kids and then you try to go to the beach. It's like a 3-hour prep time, and afterwards you got to vacuum the sand out of the vehicle, and everything is work in life. Even our play is work. I've had people kind of poke fun at me because I'll take a vacation to go elk hunting or go on a canoe trip where you just work your tail off, and you work it for months to get in shape to do the thing that's recreational. Everything is work. If you train your children to work well, you'll set them up for success when they get older. The next skill set, strengthen your marriage. Just a note to single parents, if you apply these principles to your relationships in general, it's helpful. So this isn't just for married couples. Sometimes we don't have a choice but to work outside of that design through death or divorce and other circumstances. But cultivating healthy relationships with people, learning how to resolve conflict, living joyfully, overflows on your kids. Now, some children grow up thinking in their mind, I will never get married. Now, usually the circumstance in which that falls is a home full of conflict and difficulty between mom and dad and all kinds of strife and maybe sometimes even some trauma that they've experienced in their childhood. And as a result, they don't have an inclination toward God's model because they didn't see God's model being modeled. So, best case scenario, your daughters will grow up to look for a man like dad, and your sons will grow up to look for a woman like mom, because you've modeled exactly what it's supposed to look like. And so just to boil that down a little bit, that means a healthy marriage, you agree on things like discipline. You agree on plans. You're doing things together as a family and as a house. You're kind to one another. You act kindly. What a bonus if your children grow up knowing that mom and dad love each other. Wouldn't that be nice? A strong marriage provides emotional security and lessens the anxiety and fear that comes with a strife-filled house. Imagine for a second what it would be like to be growing up in Jacob's house in the book of Genesis. You got a house with 4 moms, stepbrothers and sisters all over the place. Who's who? Who's preferred? Who's the favorite? Talk about dysfunction. We use this term dysfunction. All of us have dysfunction because all of us are sinners. But what we want in our household is to work at having the least amount of dysfunction possible, which really takes some striving and effort on our part. So, strong relationships in home. The next skill set, teach kids to face challenges. When I read the transition from the book of Deuteronomy to the book of Joshua, I hear these words over and over from God to Joshua. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Why? Because he was going to face some huge challenges in his life. We need to know how to face a challenge. Now, we live in a system where we've got government programs against bullying. Any success there, you think? Do you think a government program is going to stop bullying forever? There's a bully in every school. There's a bully on every block. Children face challenges as they grow. Friends will abandon them, and they'll face the challenge of loneliness. They'll chase the challenge of lack of confidence. They won't win all the time, and they'll face failure. So we need to cultivate our kids with a safe risk-taking mentality so that they will have a spirit that's willing to engage in challenges instead of running away from them. Really, really important. And another thing here, in a culture where you can unplug from reality and play a game for 6 hours or surf the internet for 7 hours, we live in a culture that very easily will allow you to disengage from reality and go to a separate world. And ignoring problems never makes a problem better. So we've got to be intentional about teaching them to face problems. Oftentimes, what that means is we have to be transparent with our kids about our problems. They know the problems we have, and they see how we are facing our problems, so they know that you're not running away from your problems either. So you're being a model in this. Next skill set, cultivate your children to be independent. The text here that I've referenced has to do with the quiver and the arrows. Most parents do not have a desire to have your children living at home when they're in their 40s. Children in current day society are living at home longer than ever. Now, granted, we shouldn't have such a spirit that I can't wait till my kids get to be 18 so I can, get on with my life. That's not it. I want to have confidence that my kids can make it on their own and that they have the skill set not to be dependent on mom and dad. They don't have to be dependent on the insurance until they're 26. They don't have to be dependent on finances until they decide to move out. So I think you got the point on that one. Cultivate your kids to be independent. Today, one of the popular terms is helicopter parenting. You're just kind of hovering over your kids all the time, keeping them safe, being there for everything. Really cultivates a I'm the center of the universe kind of mentality in kids. Be intentional about teaching your children to be able to do things on their own. So if you're a mechanic and you're working in the garage with one of your boys, it takes more work for you to have them do it. I realize that. But if you only let them hold the flashlight while you do all the jobs, they're not going to know how to do it when they get older. If they're only the tool fetcher, and you're doing the work, your hands are greasy, get me this socket, get me that wrench, get me that thing, and they get the tools from the toolbox, but they never turn a wrench themselves, they will be dependent on you to fix your car forever. Or they might have to pay somebody to do those jobs. So teach your kids skills so they can have those skills when they go off on their own. Next tool, teach your kids social skills. This one comes really natural, but these are the things that children usually learn in preschool and kindergarten, and the things that you've already been reinforcing in them already. Teaching them to share, apologize, say thank you, respect authority, do what grandma and grandpa say when you drop them off to babysit, pick up your toys after it. A lot of that stuff are social interaction skills. Actually, I'll borrow a little expression from Jordan Peterson in his 12 Rules for Life. Train up your children so that other people will like them. Train up your children so you will like them. And if your child's a little monster, the reality is you probably don't want to spend much time with them. You'd rather be off by yourself. But if you ever want someone to babysit your children, or you want to drop them off at school and not spend a half an hour with the teacher after that first day of school, you have to train them so that they're likable. So social skills are a big thing. And by the way, most of the foundations for social skills are established before a child is 5 years old. So start fast, otherwise you're behind already. The next one, dedicate time to your kids. Kind of goes without saying, but children spell love T-I-M-E. If you don't spend time with your kids, the message is clear. You'd rather be doing something else, or you'd rather be going somewhere with somebody else. So take your kids with you. Be intentional about spending time with your kids. Do one-on-one stuff once in a while so that they get attention if you have more than one. Play with them. Listen to them. Listen to their stories. It reinforces how important they are. Anyone knows this, show up at important things. If you miss an important thing that's important to the kid, you'll probably hear about it for the rest of your life because they don't forget it. Because even their little brain, when they're, let's say, that second grade Thanksgiving program where they have the pilgrim hat and they're up in front on the bleachers or they're doing a little program, the first thing they do, they walk out and they stand up there and they're like this. Right? It's a comfort to know that you are there. Very, very important to reinforce that you're there when you need them. And that's my last point. The other one is more of a summary. Model all the above. Don't be the parent that teaches your kid not to yell and say, do what I say, not what I do. You know, all of us kind of get a high cringe factor when we see a parent saying, stop yelling! You know, we have to model that which we expect. Very, very important. And usually when we see a child swearing or doing something that is inappropriate for that age, those children are mimicking their parents. And kids mimic us all the time. Here's an example of an overly permissive parent that didn't set healthy boundaries at home. A father who socially drinks every time there's a social event. Whether it be family, friends, whatever, any occasion is a good occasion to drink. And this is actually based on a true story. Police officer comes to the door and gives the news that their son has been killed in a car accident in which their son was driving drunk. To settle his nerves, the father goes to the liquor cabinet, opens it up, and finds a note with an empty space where the bottle was. Dad, I took this because I knew you wouldn't mind. We need to model that which we expect of our children. In all ways, our kids copy us all the time. In our interrelationships, in our behavior, in how we spend our time, our Christian worldview, everything. So if you're going to get any skill set at all, set the best example that you possibly can, and that'll get you on the right foot. Are there any questions about any of these points? I know it's a little bit hard to do the question thing after going through so much. Yeah.
Say that you have one parent that cares or is the primary parent more than the other. How do you get on the same page as someone who wants to be on the same page,
Right.
but the other is not willing to?
Okay, so the question is, you have one parent that's more of a caregiver than the other one, maybe outside of the home, and you want to be on the same page, make the sacrifices necessary to make the other parent more involved. To have one parent that is doing the bulk of the parenting without a partnership is out of balance. And so you need to work hard at making that even. And to be on the same page, both have to be discussing that. So if one parent is gone for a while, you have to have kind of the after report. So if you go to a hospital and there's care for a patient, there's always the shift change report time. And at the shift change, the nurses on the shift before give you an update on all the patients of their current status so that you know how to care for them now. And for parents, that's really important to get the after report, especially if sometimes life is really busy and you're sort of like the WWE, the tag team. You're just like, you tag out and the other parent's in, and then you're out because you got this to do and that to do and this to do and that to do. And the more busy your household, the harder that is. So 2 things. You might have to simplify the order in your house to get it more under control. And the second is work really hard at communicating. Really good question. Any other questions?
Do you think it's appropriate to mail these to people that have kids? What do you think the note should say along with it?
Yeah. So you've got a neighbor down the street, and their children have vandalized your garage. Just take this copy, send it to them anonymously in the mail. The question was, how do we get this information to someone you know who needs it? If you know some parents that are conscientious Christians and they want to raise their kids, but they might benefit from something like this, just let them know, our pastor is doing a series on this, and you can link the message on YouTube, and it's got this document attached to it, so they could connect with the lecture and the notes. In the description of the YouTube page. So, and eventually we'll have this link to the website too in the future. So, very good question. But most unsolicited advice is not accepted. So, just if you've got I know that as we get a little bit older, if you're a grandparent and you're thinking, boy, I wish my kids would do this, don't just say, hey. That might be tough. Any other questions? Yeah.
I just have a comment.
Okay.
Eric and I were challenged last year to come up with family values.
Yes.
Which is very similar to
Yep.
things on this list, and it was just really helpful for us to get on the same page of what we want for our kids, not only short term but long term, what we want to model in our household.
Right.
And it was really helpful.
Right. If you've not had a conversation about what family values you put first, I grew up in a household, there wasn't a list on the fridge like the 10 Commandments of the DeVry house. There wasn't anything like that. But growing up in our house, values were really well known as far as priority. And it was God, family, country. All were really important. When we went to a parade, if a flag went by, our entire family would stand up. If a veteran went by, we would stand up. There was a commitment civically to our country, but nothing overshadowed God. So it was God, family, country. Those are the primary values in our house, in my house growing up. Sometimes it is very beneficial to do that for your house. And some go so far as to say, what is the mission of our house? And if you have that in print on the fridge or something like that, it reminds everybody in the house what's expected. We're a family on a mission. And, or let's say your primary mission is to grow future disciples of Christ, will be faithful with him for the rest of their days. Something like that. Set your vision for your house biblically, and you can't really go wrong with it. Any other questions or final thoughts? Okay. Just a word about next week. Let's see. Oh, right here. Next week, Gen Z. So Generation Z is next week, the challenges of raising kids in a digital age. And as I've researched this, it's an extremely important subject for parents of all ages. The earlier you get started, the better. But on that note, I'll have a closing prayer. Jesus, thank you for being present with us today, first in worship and then gathering together with all the parents here. I pray, Lord, that you would continue to teach and train us as parents so that we can teach and train our children with a proper example. And that we'd be good at it, that we'd actually cultivate some skills as parents that we would be able to reproduce over and over and over again for the great blessing of our next generation. In Jesus' name, amen.